Innocence and Ink. Previous episodes are available on playlist, a link is given in the video description. Episode 4. Bye. He finished his drink and hung up the phone. He told Marco, "You can say what you want. I'm in a good mood." The man looked at him with interest and stirred his drink. After a while, he said, "You two make a very interesting couple." Kade leaned against the counter and shrugged, trying to come up with an answer. He laughed and said, "A lot of people are shocked when they see us together." After thinking about how to describe himself, he said, "She's very small and fragile, and I'm not." Marco let out a funny huff before carefully picking his words. "Does she know?" he asked, knowing that Kade would understand what he meant. Kade nodded and bit the inside of his cheek. "She found out." There was silence for a while before Kade decided it was time to leave. After moving away from the counter, he said, "I'm going to leave." Marco nodded. "I'll make sure everything goes well on my end." Kade nodded, and they both walked to the elevator to get out of the penthouse. As he walked through the front door, Kade whispered, "Isla." He had just gotten home, and since it was almost 1 a.m., he wasn't sure if Isla was still awake. He took off his shoes and walked up the stairs, trying to make his steps light, which was hard because he was so big. Kade started to take off his belt before he got to the room because he couldn't wait to get undressed. He was very tired. He was feeling the pressure of the threat to his business, and he was the last person to admit any flaws, but this seemed to be one. Seeing Isla safe and wearing one of his t-shirts made him feel like he had just taken a shot of alcohol. She looked happy, and he had to smile because he was the one who made her that way. Kade took off the rest of his clothes, except for his boxers, and then carefully slid under the sheets and let out a tired sigh. He turned to the side and hugged Isla to his chest. Then he smelled her hair and kissed the top of her head. "Good night," he mumbled. His words were slurred with sleep as he started to fade away. Isla had woken up in Kade's arms, a position she had come to love since they had been together. Thinking about her childhood home made her eyes hurt. Because of the bad relationship she had with her last carer, the happy memories she used to have would now leave a bad taste in her mouth. Isla moved in Kade's arms, trying to get rid of those thoughts and bring herself back to the present. She wanted to focus on the present. The present was good. She nodded her head in agreement and brushed some blonde hair out of her face. Then she froze when she heard running water coming from downstairs. She waited a little while to make sure it wasn't a broken pipe or something else that could be explained, but when the sound stopped and the glass clinking started, the girl whined and shook the big arm that could protect her if she needed it. She was scared and tears started to form in her eyes when she heard footsteps coming up the stairs. She called him in fear. "Kade," she whispered in a panic, her eyes darting between him and the door. Kade's eyes slowly opened, and he groaned before realizing that Isla was crying and acting scared and frantic. "What's wrong, baby?" he asked, his voice heavy with sleep. Isla held on to him tightly and stuttered. "There's someone here." Kade frowned and opened his mouth to ask her something, but before he could, the door to his room flew open. "Kade, I'm G." Micah's eyes got big, and he looked back and forth between the two of them in shock before calming down and saying, "Oops." Kade's eyes were blazing with rage, and he sat up to block Isla's view of him. Leave. His words dripped with authority, and Isla even flinched at the way he spoke. Micah backed out, closed the door, and yelled a short sorry before walking back downstairs. "I'm sorry he scared you, baby." He frowned and kissed her hair. Isla whispered shakily, "I'm fine." "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm going to beat him up for coming in like that. He knows I hate it when he does that." Isla laughed a little and moved away from the big man. "I'm fine, I promise," she said with a small smile. Kade smiled and jumped on her, tickling her sides hard. "Really? That pretty face looks like it's frowning." He made fun of her while poking her with his fingers. Isla screamed and laughed as she tried to get away from the pain. "I'm sure," she yelled through her laughter, and her cheeks were now rosy and red. Kade smiled and let go of her, but not before giving her a sweet kiss on the nose. He said, "I'll be back," and put on some sweats but not a shirt. Isla nodded, a little out of breath, and pulled the sheets up to her chin to feel better. Kade's mood got a little worse as he walked down the stairs, making heavy footsteps. "Micah, you're lucky I didn't have my gun with me, because if I had, you would have gotten a bullet between your eyes." Kade turned the corner and saw his friend drinking coffee. There was already a second cup brewed and sitting on the counter. "Coffee?" Micah asked. Kade stood by the door and sighed before picking up the cup and drinking it. "This doesn't mean I'm not mad," he said between sips. Micah chuckled and nodded. Kade was his best friend and had known him for years, but when he got angry, he was unpredictable, and he didn't want to be in the situation he was in right now. "So, why did you have to come into my house without asking?" Kade asked. "Again?" Micah grinned and tapped his fingers on the counter. "Well," he stopped talking. "I'm going on vacation." Kade almost choked on his drink when he heard what he said. There was no such thing as a vacation in his line of work. Not unless you were very high up. This wasn't a government job where you were guaranteed dental and other benefits. He sells drugs. Planned trips made people think there was collusion, and it was possible that competitors could get information about the business in painful ways. Micah was pretty high up, though, so those risks didn't really matter. Still, it caught Kade off guard because he'd never said anything like that to him before. Kade asked with a smile, "Are you going to swim with the dolphins in the Bahamas?" Micah smiled and nodded. "Yes, actually." Kade laughed in disbelief. "And what made you think of this?" he asked, resting his elbows on the counter. Micah shrugged and set his cup down on the hard surface in front of him. He simply said, "I want to do something different." Kade nodded, drank his coffee, and then put it in the sink. "Then go," he said before turning around. "You have my permission." Micah smiled and clapped his hands on the table. "Thanks, bro. You should take a break too." He said this while putting his hand on Kade's shoulder. "It would be good for you." Kade nodded, but not very hard. He liked the idea of going on vacation, but he knew he couldn't do that until he got his business in order. He walked Micah to the door and waved goodbye as soon as he left. He turned around when he heard hesitant steps coming down the stairs. When he saw a lot of blonde hair, he smiled. "I'm sorry about that." "He's gone now," he said as he walked up to her. Isla laughed and shook her head before going towards the kitchen. It's fine. It was scary at the time, but he's not dangerous, she said. Kade watched eagerly as she took some pots and eggs out of the fridge. I want to make breakfast. Is that okay? She asked as she whisked the eggs. Of course I love your cooking, he said softly, putting his hands on her waist. When his phone rang from upstairs, he groaned and backed away from the little girl, but not before giving her a soft squeeze on the back. I have to get that, he said in a tone that showed he didn't want to. I'm fine over here, she said, not paying attention. Kade walked to the stairs and took them two at a time, just in time to grab his phone. What is it? He asked. We have a place. Kade's eyes got big, and he went to his closet to get a black long-sleeve shirt and a pair of ripped black jeans. I'm on my way, he said before hanging up. He ran to the bathroom, took a quick shower, and then put on his clothes, letting his hair dry naturally. As he jogged down the stairs, his big feet made noise, and he heard Isla call his name as he went to get his gun from his office. Just a second, he yelled as he opened his drawer and saw the black gun. Kade was halfway through putting his gun in his pants when he heard someone knock on the door. He groaned loudly in annoyance. God, can I get a break? I swear to God. He said this as he walked up to the door. He opened it and pulled the gun out right away, then pushed it into the man's chest in front of him. He was furious and said, I don't have time for this. Kade pushed harder on the gun, making the man on the other end back up. This gave Kade the chance to leave his house and shut the door behind him. Please listen to me for a second, the man begged, his eyes full of guilt. Kade was shocked by how emotional his so-called brother was. He was usually like a stone, hard to read and not very talkative. He didn't want to say it, but he had learned that from him. What business could you possibly have with me? You came to my house, and I see that as a threat. I'm here to say I'm sorry. Kade's hold on the gun slipped, and he lost his balance. What? At one point, he let slip how much his brother bothered him. 4 words had caught him off guard. He had put himself in danger. He realized this and tightened his grip on the gun before turning off the safety. So you came here to mess with me? Great. He laughed in a sarcastic way. Get off my property now, or I'll shoot you in the chest. I have things to do. I mean it, Kade. We hadn't seen each other in years before the farm. I know that's my fault, so I'm here to talk it out with you. We deserve that. Kade's jaw twitched when he heard what he said, and he stepped forward, letting the gun fall to his side. You don't deserve anything, he said. I didn't stop Dad all those years ago because I didn't want to seem weak. I was the heir to his empire, and I needed to be strong. Helping the person he hated the most would have ruined the love he had for me and the plans he had for me. I was selfish and cared more about the power than my own brother. Kade was now biting his jaw to keep himself from hitting him in the face. He wanted to hurt him so badly, but a small part of him needed to hear what he was saying. Vincent took his silence as a sign to keep going, so he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I didn't know what to do after you killed him. I had this big title and all this power. He turned away from Kade and stared off into space. And I wanted to take it all. Kade couldn't stop himself from hitting his brother in the jaw with his fist. Vincent swore and touched his bottom lip, which was bleeding from the punch. I know that sounds bad, but that's what it was. I didn't realize how much it messed you up until I heard that you got into this business on purpose and were my competition in no time. Kade's face stayed straight, but his eyes drifted to the window on his right, where he saw the curtains pulled back and a pair of blue eyes watching what was going on. He wanted so badly to get her out of that spot, but his brother was still there and he didn't want him to see her. I guess I was mad at you for that. I just got all this money and power, and then out of nowhere, you were catching up to me and ready to take it away. But after seeing you, I realized how messed up I am and how much you really hate me. He laughed painfully at the end. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I'm just saying I'm done with this. He waved his hands back and forth. This fight we have going on. Kade gave him a strange look and then looked down at his phone when it buzzed. Listen, I have to go. Vincent cut in, you can have it. Kade looked confused and furrowed his brows. What? You can have everything. I'm leaving to clear my head, and I don't know when I'll be back. There won't be any more competition. Nothing. Kade didn't know what to think. He liked to earn what he had. He didn't like being in debt to people. Thanks, but no thanks. You can do what you want, but please don't bother me. He turned around and walked back into his house, looking forward instead of back. Isla asked, "What happened?" in a worried voice. As soon as Kade shut the door, she ran up to him and brushed some hair out of his eyes with her hands. Kade sighed and looked away from her. Instead, he walked around her and put his hands on the kitchen island. Nothing. He wasn't telling the truth. He was breathing heavily and bit his tongue to keep his emotions in check, but a tear that he didn't want to show broke through. He angrily swiped it away and hit the hard surface with his fist, which made Isla jump. I have to leave. Isla scrunched her eyebrows in confusion as she tried to read his body language. She didn't want to go up to him and make him feel like he had to do something. At that moment, it looked like he needed some time alone. That didn't give her much reason to help him. She had no idea what to do. He kept his head down and walked around her again, this time towards the front door. Wait, Kade. Isla's words went unheard as she tried to get his attention. When she heard a bang, her eyes shut tight, and she had to press her tongue to the roof of her mouth to keep herself from crying. Where is it? Kade got to his storage warehouse, where he had planned to meet Marco to avoid being seen by others. It was clear that he was unhappy. He was nervous and tense with his black gun in his hand. Anyone who wanted to make him mad was in danger right now. Marco looked at him with suspicion, not quite at ease being around his boss because of how strange he was acting. Albany is almost an hour away from here. It's in a pretty public place, which is surprising but also smart. Kade nodded and walked back and forth, turning the safety on and off on his gun. I'd get more people to help with the ambush, but I don't know who I can trust right now, he said angrily. I've had enough of this waiting around crap. The two of us are going to have to go in. Marco slowly nodded, not wanting to say anything that would make him angry, since it was clear that his mind wasn't right. Kade walked to a wall in the room's far corner and typed in a code. The fake structure pulled back to show a group of guns, from small handguns to big semi-automatic guns. This is my personal collection that I've built up over the years. Kade took an AK-47 that was hidden on the wall and took the magazine out to see if it was loaded. He put it back in place and looked at Marco, whose eyes were shining like it was Christmas. "Well," he said, nodding his head towards the guns. "Are you going to take one?" Marco's eyes got big, and he nodded his head so hard that he almost ran up to the wall of goodies. He ran his fingers over the black weapons and carefully chose a double-action revolver, just like Kade had done, and checked to see if it had bullets. Kade asked, raising an eyebrow, "Are you happy?" Marco nodded yes, a small smile on his face. "Very." Kade smiled and walked towards the door to get in his car, with Marco right behind him. Isla stayed in the same spot for 10 minutes after Kade left. What just took place? It was clear that talking to his brother had made him angry, but she didn't know how much because he was gone. She was embarrassed to say it, but she had become very close to Kade. Dependent would be a better word. She didn't know what to do. She decided that the best thing for her to do was to stick to her weekly routine and wait for Kade to come by and talk to her when he was calmer. Isla slowly made her way to the kitchen and ate the breakfast she had made for two. She put the leftovers in the fridge and went upstairs to get ready for work. She blinked at herself in the mirror, trying to focus on how she looked instead of all the thoughts that were racing through her mind. She felt lazy and let her blonde hair fall messily down her back. It was getting colder, so she put a clear gloss on top of her favorite chapstick to protect it from the dry air even more. She sighed, put her phone in her pocket, and grabbed a light jacket. She didn't even think about her walk to work because she already knew the area. When she opened the door, a cool breeze hit her face, and she kept walking at a steady pace, which got her to her destination quickly. The girl was very happy that the store wasn't too busy when she got there. She smiled weakly at Bryn before going to the back room to start getting ready. "This is it." Marco nodded to show he understood and let out a breath. Kade looked up at the building that looked normal and fit in perfectly with the other buildings around it. They parked in a lot across the street and looked like they belonged there. It was big and looked like a business, so you wouldn't think there would be a lot of coke there. Maybe bringing the shipment here was a smart move. Hiding it out in the open is risky, but smart. They keep it here, sort it, and then send it to another place to keep the product moving. Kade hummed to show that he understood what he said. At this point, they all agreed that this person was either dealing drugs or at least handling them. It was clear that they couldn't show up with guns blazing now that they knew what the place looked like. Kade laughed and put on his aviators. This person clearly thought that where they were was safe. No one in their right mind would shoot up in a public place and risk getting caught. It's a good thing he wasn't thinking straight. "Bring the gun, but don't do anything until I say so." Kade got out of the car and crossed the street. People walking by and driving by kept staring at him. He stood in front of the doors and turned his head to look at Marco, who was next to him. He pushed the door, but it wouldn't budge, and a Cheshire grin crept across his face. What Kade's smile faded as he pushed on the door again, which was locked. Sir." He turned around and saw a tall woman looking at him in a strange way. "What?" Kade said in a rude way. The woman in her 40s raised an eyebrow. That building has been getting fixed up for almost 2 years. Of course, he said under his breath. What was that? The woman asked, confused. Nothing. He changed the subject. Why are you telling me this? The woman put her hand on her hip and pointed to the patio-style store next to the building. You're making my customers scared. Kade then noticed that she was wearing an apron, and when he looked up, he saw that her business was a library and cafe combined. He felt guilty and shifted uncomfortably at the thought of the cafe, which brought back memories of things that had happened earlier in the day that he had tried to push out of his mind until he had to deal with them later. He didn't say anything to the woman and turned around to walk the other way. He could barely hear Marco thank her instead. He spoke when he heard footsteps running up next to him. We're going to go around the block to get to the back of the building. Sounds good. Kade soon found himself in front of another door, but this one was old and rusty, which made sense since it was the back door. He had climbed over a fence to get there, and the parking lot around it was empty. Marco swiped a black card on the keypad next to the door. This caused the internal hardware to short-circuit, which disabled the locks. He pushed through the door and whistled softly while looking around. Seems like no one is home. The inside was just like what the woman had said. It seemed like the building was being worked on. Plastic was draped over the furniture, and the floors had been stripped of the flooring that was there before. It was a pretty big space, and if he was being honest, it was bigger than his own. Kade whispered, "Keep it down, we don't know if we're alone here," as he pulled back a curtain. He went up the stairs, trying to be quiet even though the wood was too loud to be stealthy. They looked on a few floors before hearing a voice on the 5th one. "Yes, I plan to be up and running in 6 months. I have my team ready, and as soon as my sites are ready, I can start taking clients." Before the person went on, there was a laugh. "Yes, Terry, you're my first priority." Kade had found out who the criminal was by now. And it hit home. When Kade felt a barrel press against his head, he froze. "Looks like we have a snoop." Kade's jaw tightened, and he let go of his gun. He was so angry that he said, "I'm going to kill you." Marco's eyes showed a brief flash of regret before he pushed the barrel of the gun harder against Kade's head, forcing him to go into the room. Finally. "I've been waiting in this dump for hours." Marco rolled his eyes. "Okay, we're here now, so let's get on with it." Micah's face turned dark, and he hit the table with his fists, which made Marco jump. "Don't forget who's in charge here," he said in a threatening way. Kade took advantage of Marco's weakness and grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back so he could keep the gun he had. He then wrapped his bicep around the man's neck to keep him still while he pushed the gun against his head. "Exactly what are you trying to do here?" Kade asked in a calm voice. "I can't believe someone could be so stupid as to do whatever." He lifted the gun from Marco's head and pointed it around the room. "This is..." Kade brought his hand back down and hit Marco's head with the gun. Marco's body fell to the floor with a loud thud. "Did you really think you could steal from me and get away with it? You must think I'm an idiot." He laughed. Kade moved closer to Micah and pushed him against the wall. "I bet you want me to shoot you right now," he said in a low voice. "It would be a quick death, nothing to write home about. Kade threw the gun away and hit the wall with his fist. But you won't be that lucky. When Micah smirked, he got even angrier. Micah said with a smile, "You haven't been in charge for a long time, my friend." Kade's arms were suddenly tied behind his back, and he was being pulled away from the boy with curly hair. "Your feelings for Vincent Rhodes have kept us from moving forward for years. You act tough and strong, but he had you at his mercy and didn't even have to be there to do it." Kade yelled and fought against the men. "You just want what I have, the money, the power." Kade calmed down and smiled with a glint in his eyes. Micah walked up to him and stood right in front of him, with their noses almost touching. His words got him punched in the face. "I don't want anything from you," he said angrily. Micah turned his head. "You're lucky I don't want that sweet girl of yours." His eyes looked past him at the men who were holding him. "Not the same for my men, though." Kade's leg hit Micah's crotch hard, making him scream in pain. "If you even think about touching her or talking about her, I'll rip off you that you'll see stars." Kade was furious by this point, and his body was painfully tense. Micah groaned and laughed as he leaned against the wooden desk. "Look, Kade, you can't touch me, so your empty threats don't scare me." He let out a huff as he got up from the ground. "It's really rude to keep something so cute and pretty to yourself, my dear friend. I can't believe you let her leave the house in those skirts. I mean, I had a hard time keeping a raging boner at bay." Micah laughed because he thought it was funny that Kade was getting angrier. "But don't worry, I like brunettes better." He smiled and tapped his nose. "Anyway, if you haven't figured it out yet, I'm in charge now. We need someone who can get things done and is fully committed to this life. This is our life." Micah went back to his desk and sat down, wincing a little at the pain in his crotch. Kade smiled at him with blood on his face, and the other person rolled his eyes. "You probably heard me on the phone earlier with one of our biggest clients, Terry Macario. This place is just the start of my drug ring's growth, and I'll be hiring a new team to run it very soon." He looked at the big man and tapped his fingers on the desk. "I wish I could say I'm sorry, but I can't," he said with a crooked smile. "Hold on to the good times, my friend." Micah waved his hand slowly to tell his men to get rid of Kade. At that point, Kade didn't even try to fight back. He just looked his old best friend in the eye and said 2 words. "You're dead." Micah felt a chill run down his spine when he saw the cold look in his eyes and heard the hopeful tone in his voice. His smile faded a little. "Take him out already." Someone pulled Kade away from the door and down the stairs. He was pushed into a car, and he wished he had his gun with him so he could shoot the people he knew who he could finally see. The door slammed shut, cutting off his view. While he was in the car, Kade had to work hard to control himself. He wanted to grab the man at the wheel by the throat, but he had to think carefully about what to do. He knew they were taking him to a deserted place to kill him, and he was going to use that to his advantage. He came up with his plan during the 40 minutes it took to get there, and when the car stopped, he was ready. Kade lunged forward and used his hands to choke the driver to death. The other guy in the passenger seat screamed and dropped the gun, but it was too late. Kade slammed the driver's head against the steering wheel and took the gun from the amateur's hands. He then shot the amateur between the eyes and then shot the driver in the back of the head. He used his hand to get rid of the red stuff that had gotten on his face and the windows. He said to himself, "This is stupid." He ran his fingers through his hair and pulled on the strands before slamming his fist on the back seat window over and over again, breaking it. After he calmed down, Kade got out of the car and opened the front doors to pull the bodies out. He sighed and looked around. When he saw all the green, he groaned. God! Kade opened the trunk of the car and looked at how much room was in the back. They should fit, he said quietly. 20 minutes later, he had successfully loaded the bodies into the trunk of the car and was leaning against it, tired. He didn't know what he was going to do, to be honest. Micah seemed to have taken over his empire all by himself, and even though he didn't want to admit it, that's what happened. There had to be some people who stayed loyal to him, but they probably didn't do anything to stay alive. He thought it was completely useless. Kade was more worried about killing Micah and keeping Isla safe than he was about saving what was left of his business at this point. This was no longer his life. It was hard to admit that Micah was right in one way. He didn't feel the need to stay on top anymore, that hunger was satisfied the day he met Isla. He laughed and shook his head. He didn't want it, but he couldn't let Micah have it. Isla had been home from work for 3 hours and was starting to worry about Kade. She had called him more than a dozen times, but after a while, her calls went straight to voicemail. Is he trying to stay away from me? She walked back and forth in their bedroom, trying to calm her breathing. There could be a lot of reasons why he wasn't picking up her calls and why he was out so late. His phone might have died, and maybe something came up at work. See? He's fine, she said to herself. She heard a door slam shut all of a sudden. She jumped at the noise, and her heart raced in her chest. "Baby!" A voice that sounded rough called out. Isla's breath caught in her throat, and she fell forward before running down the stairs to greet the man who had been missing all day. But when she saw him, she stopped. His clothes were ripped and dirty like he had been dragged through the mud or had been in a fight. His hair, which was usually neat, was a mess on his head. When Isla saw his face, she choked on a sob and put her hand over her mouth. There was so much blood everywhere that it was hard to tell where it was coming from. Kade grimaced and wiped his hands on his pants. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said to the crying girl to try to calm her down. Isla ran up to him and raised her hands to touch him, but they shook in the air because she didn't want to hurt him. He said softly, "I'm fine, baby, come here," and then he hugged her tightly. Isla cried and screamed nonsense while he held her in his arms. At that moment, she didn't even think about getting covered in his blood. "What happened? You were gone for so long. I was so worried," she cried. "You're bleeding." Isla sniffed and moved away from his chest. She took his hand and led him up to their bathroom. "Where does it hurt?" she asked after she made him sit on the toilet seat. Kade tried to smile to show her he was okay, but his busted lip made it look more like a painful grimace. "Kade, I'm serious," she whined, and tears started to fall down her face again. Kade's smile faded, and he sighed. She stood between his legs. "I don't know where to start," she said, rubbing his jaw softly. She turned it to the side and saw purple bruises, which made her cry even more. "I know you're hurting," he said, "baby, I've been through worse. I only got punched once, the rest of the blood isn't even mine." Isla didn't like that information, though. "How did this happen?" she asked quietly as she wet a clean cloth. Kade let out a sigh and tried to relax on the toilet seat by spreading his legs and leaning back. He said, "There was an issue at work." Isla frowned and turned around, not happy with his answer. She began to wipe the blood off his face, and her heart rate slowed down a little when she saw that he was telling the truth about how badly he was hurt. She said, "I'm a big girl, I can handle it." Her voice wavered, though, which showed that she wasn't just trying to convince him with her words. Kade shook his head and played with her hair. "It's a long story, and I don't have the energy to tell it right now." Isla frowned. "But Kade gave her a stern look, which made her stop talking in the middle of her sentence. He groaned and grabbed her hips when he saw her face. "I'm sorry, baby. I promise I'll tell you everything, but not right now, okay?" Isla bit her lip and nodded, but not happily. She was happy to see that he only had a busted lip and bruises on his jaw and cheek after she had cleaned his face. He was still hurt, but not as much as before, even though there was a lot of blood. "What are you going to do now?" she asked after he got up. She had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye because he was now a head taller than her again. He looked away from her and said, "I have to go back." Isla's eyes got bigger and she gasped as she held on to his arm. "What do you mean? You're still hurt?" She ran out in a hurry. Her eyes were puffy from crying, but they looked like they were a bottomless pit full of tears because they just kept coming. He grabbed her chin and made sure she was paying attention. "If I don't finish up at work, you won't be safe. The only thing that matters to me is your safety." Isla shook her head and moved away from him. Her eyes were full of tears, but they also held despair, fear, and hopelessness. "Your safety is the only thing that matters to me," she said, her voice breaking. "Please don't go." Kade's heart broke for her, but he knew what he had to do. "Baby, I'm not going yet. Please stop crying, you're killing me," he said softly as he held her close. "Okay, I promise I won't be gone for long," he said softly in her ear. "And when I get back, we can watch movies and cuddle while we eat ice cream. How does that sound?" he asked as he stroked her hair. Isla sniffled and nodded against his chest, holding on to the fabric of his shirt as if it were her last hope. Kade hummed and gently pulled her back. "How about we clean up?" he suggested. Isla nodded shyly and wiped her eyes. "I'm supposed to be taking care of you," she said in a low voice. Kade laughed and swiped her bottom lip. "I will always look out for you." Isla's cheeks turned a nice shade of red, and she looked away from him. Kade laughed at how shy she was, which made her blush even more. "Don't laugh at me," she said, her eyes still darting around at everything but his. "I can't help it, baby." "You're so cute," he said, tickling her sides. Isla laughed and hit him on the chest and arms until he gave in. "Okay, take your shirt off." Kade's eyebrows went up when she asked him to do something so bold, but his face quickly changed to a smirk. He teased, "My shy girl isn't so shy anymore, is she?" The blonde didn't like what he said, so she stepped forward to help him take off his shirt instead. She lightly ran her fingers over his toned, tattooed chest before putting them on his belt. She nervously bit her lip and looked down, then unbuckled the structure and zipped down his fly. Kade played with his tongue ring to keep his mind off the fact that Isla's small, soft hands were only a few centimeters away from him. He wasn't sure if what she did was innocent, but he wanted to see what she would do without being interrupted. Isla took off his pants, and the bigger man did what she asked and stepped out of them. Now, all she could see of him was his briefs and the rest of his body. She took her hands off of him and began to take off her own clothes. Soon, she was in the same situation as him, naked except for her underwear. The blonde girl kept taking off her clothes until she had nothing on her small body. Finally, she put her hands on the waistband of Kade's underwear and slowly pulled it down his thighs, which hurt. She blushed when she saw that he had a semi, but she didn't look at his length. Instead, she looked up at him. "Get in the shower," she said with a little bit of confidence. "Please," she said next. She remembered her manners. Kade liked that Isla was being more daring. She was still as shy as a mouse, but she felt better about herself and her body. She had a clean washcloth with his favorite body wash on it and was ready to go after a few awkward moments of turning on the shower head and setting it to the right temperature. She said with pleading eyes, "Let me take care of you for once." She washed his body in circles without any problems, being careful to be gentle even though he kept telling her he was fine. She took him under the shower head so that the water could wash away the soap. She stood between his arms and the wall. At this point, no one said anything. They didn't need to say anything because they could see how they felt for each other in their eyes. Isla whispered, "Make love to me." Kade blinked, wiped his face with his hand, and then stepped forward to completely trap her against the wall. "I thought you'd never ask," he said quietly in her ear. Isla was in his arms right away, with her legs around his waist. She gasped and put her forehead against Kade's. Their lips were close but not touching. She turned her head and kissed the side of his neck and jaw, rubbing her cheek against his. Kade shivered and squeezed her, loving how much power she had over him. He touched her between the legs with one hand, and Isla whined. "I know you're wet from the shower, but I don't care. I know you're soaking for me," he growled in her ear. When he slipped a finger into Isla's core, her breath hitched and her head fell on his shoulder as he fingered her. She groaned and bit his shoulder to calm down, but Kade slapped her when she did. He breathed in her ear, "I want to hear everything and anything that comes out of your pretty little mouth." She nodded, but when a hot tip touched her entrance, she stiffened. "Wait, I need a condom," he said under his breath before putting her down. They didn't want to go through that again. He reached out of the shower for a second to get one and put it on without any problems. "Now, where were we?" he said in a rough voice. When he told her to, Isla smiled and wrapped her legs around his waist again. When Kade's sheath filled her to the hilt, she let out a sigh of relief. He groaned, so tight, as he slipped into her warmth. Isla's breathing got faster as he started to thrust into her. He plowed into her with long, deep strokes. As he picked up the pace, she arched her back against his chest and let out sounds of pleasure from the back of her throat as their skin touched. The blonde girl put her arms around his neck and closed her eyes, trying to remember every detail of the moment. The sound, the touch, the feeling, everything. No one was promised tomorrow. "I love you," she said, breathing heavily over his lips. She tightened her legs around his hips and grabbed the wet hair on his head with her hands. Kade kissed her lips, showing that he felt the same way. He didn't know that Isla's tears were mixed in with the water that ran down her cheeks. She was so scared of losing the only man she had ever loved that nothing could hide it. Kade got out of bed quietly, trying not to make too much noise. After their shower, he put Isla to bed and planned to leave then, but when he saw her tearful eyes and pleading face, he couldn't bring himself to go. He had stroked her hair and let her sleep on his chest for as long as he could, which was about an hour and a half. He knew Micah wouldn't be doing anything at this hour, which is why he had to get to work right away. While lying in bed with Isla, he thought a lot about what he was going to do. After going over a lot of ideas and outcomes in his head, he knew what he was going to do next. Knowing Micah, he was probably in the middle of getting their biggest clients to promise to stay loyal to their drug ring, but with him as the new body in charge. Hearing him talk to Terry Macario on the phone was enough proof of this. Kade knew that many of their bigger clients would stick with him because he had been with them from the start. He was going to try to get in touch with people who would be harder for Micah to convince because of this. He knew exactly who Micah was going to call next, if he hadn't already, after narrowing down the list to people who were in town and other things. Kade walked to his closet, put on a grey suit, and then put his rings on his right finger. He was going to get his hands dirty, but that didn't mean he didn't want to look good while doing it. He ran a hand through his hair and stood there for a moment, listening to the almost deafening silence that calm before the storm. He made sure his phone was in his pocket before slowly walking over to the nightstand on his side of the bed and sliding back the fake bottom of the top drawer to get his emergency gun. He didn't want to run into anyone at the storage warehouse now that his cover had been blown. He took a deep breath and looked at Isla again. She was sound asleep, her small mouth open as she breathed. He didn't want to wake her up by touching her, so he just looked. Kade looked away from the small figure on his bed because he knew he needed to get his plan in order. He quietly walked down the stairs with his shoes in hand and then closed the front door as quietly as he could. "Let's get this done," he said under his breath. He put on his shoes and walked to his garage, which was separate from the house, and opened the door. His mind was racing as he tried to think of different ways to deal with what he was about to do. He said. He called the number, and it rang 4 times. He tapped his foot impatiently against the ground, and just as he was about to hang up, he heard someone shuffling on the other end. "Who is calling me at 2 a.m?" an angry voice with an accent asked. "Kade." "It's Kade." There was silence on the other end for a minute before the voice spoke again. "Is this a joke?" Kade sighed and rolled his eyes. He knew it would be hard to deal with this guy, so he never did it directly. "Did Micah get in touch with you recently?" Kade asked in a calm voice. "Yeah, why?" "Kade, I have to say that I'm surprised you have time to call me. We usually talk through one of your men." Kade said, "My schedule has been pretty empty lately. I guess you guys have a meeting coming up tomorrow morning, actually, so please hurry up and tell me why you called." He grumbled. Kade nodded and walked around the garage on his own. Federico, I need a favor. Because you're my oldest and one of my biggest clients, I'm asking you this. This sounds bad, Federico said with a laugh. The Italian stopped laughing when Kade didn't answer. Okay, what is it? I've been taken over. This time, Federico's laughter was more like disbelief than amusement. Why you? How did this happen, Kade? He asked after he calmed down a bit. I've been distracted, he said as he ran a hand through his hair. Okay, what do you want me to do? Kade's eyes grew wide with shock. He didn't think things would go so well. In fact, it took him months of meetings and favors to get Federico to agree to do business with him years ago. I have to go to this meeting you guys are having, but it has to be kept a secret. A pause sounded for a moment. What exactly do you plan to do? I'm going to kill him. Kade was at Federico's penthouse before the birds the next morning. Luckily, the Italian asked to have the meeting at his own place because he liked being in charge, just like Kade. He got in one of his cars and drove to Federico's house after their call ended. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep until this was taken care of. It's good to see you again, the Italian said as he fixed his cufflinks. Kade nodded and shook his hand hard. You look a little rough around the edges. Kade chuckled and ran his hand through his messy strands. Something he'd been doing constantly for the last few hours. I'm just ready to see the bastard bleed. Federico shook his head and looked unhappy. Can you please not make too much of a mess? I just had my floors redone. There was a loud knock on the door that sounded like it was in a code before Kade could answer. Federico looked at Kade, who nodded, and then he went to the door to let the guests in. Kade could hear the Italian making small talk with the people he let in, and Micah's laughter made his blood boil. Right over here, he heard them say as they turned the corner. Kade shot the first two men with Micah in the chest as soon as they could be seen, but the last one seemed to know what he was doing. He shot at Kade, and the bullet grazed his side, making him hiss and clutch the wound. Kade raised his gun and shot the man's arm, but he wouldn't give up. He ran at Kade, which was a rookie mistake, and Kade had the perfect chance to shoot him in the head. He fell to the floor with a thud, which let Kade turn his attention to Micah, who could be heard having trouble with the front door lock. Kade took his time getting to Micah. When he did, he grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and dragged him back to where the bodies were. He threw him to the ground, and Micah screamed, which made Kade look at him. "You're such a Micah!" He laughed. "3 men weren't enough to keep you safe," he said, getting closer to the traitor. Micah got up quickly and tried to keep a blank face, but his mask started to crack as Kade got closer. "Listen, Kade, even if you do kill me, you won't be able to get everyone to trust you again. You know that, right?" he said with a forced laugh. "I don't care about the people down there," Kade said before shooting his leg. Micah screamed as he hobbled back. Kade shot him again in the other leg and said, "You should know better than anyone what happens when people try to mess with me. Can't we just talk about this?" Micah yelled as he fell to the floor. "What is there to talk about?" Kade turned to Federico and asked, "Did I forget to say something or?" Federico shrugged and drank what looked like an alcoholic drink. "I don't think so, though." Kade nodded and turned back to Micah, who was crawling away. "Where do you think you're going?" He laughed before shooting him in the back. Micah screamed in pain again and fell to the floor, giving up on getting away. Federico frowned at the blood and yelled for Kade. "Can we keep the bullet wounds to a minimum?" he said, pointing to the floors. Kade rolled his eyes and turned back to Micah, who was now bleeding a lot and about to pass out. He walked over to him and bent down to look him in the eye. "Did you really think it would be that easy to get rid of me?" Micah mumbled nonsense and his eyes started to close. Hey, Kade said while hitting his face. "Don't go to sleep on me now." "God," Micah screamed when Kade pushed his thumb into one of his wounds. "I'm glad I have your attention," he said with a smile. "You know, when I came here, I was just going to kill you." He started spinning the gun on his forefinger. "I mean, I'm still going to kill you, but now I think I'm going to take back what's rightfully mine," Kade said, making sure to keep eye contact with the man who was barely alive. "What do you think of that?" Micah cursed before spitting blood in his face. Kade winced and wiped the spit off with a handkerchief from his pocket. Then he shot him in the neck, which made blood gush out of his carotid artery, which made him choke and die on his own blood. He muttered, "Disgusting," and swiped at his face again. "I told you, Kade, I'll pay for your floors." Kade drove home feeling good about himself and finally free of the stress that Micah and his fantasies had caused him. But when he pulled into the driveway of his house, he frowned when he saw an unknown car parked crookedly on the asphalt. He immediately put up his guard and reached for his gun, which was on top of his suit jacket in the passenger seat. "I swear to God, I'm moving after this." He said it under his breath. He quietly closed the car door behind him so that the people inside wouldn't hear it. His thoughts went to Isla, and his heart stopped beating. He had forgotten that he had left her in there. He hurried to the front door and cringed when it squeaked as he opened it. "You don't know how loud everything is until it gets quiet." Kade walked softly around the lower floor of his house with his gun raised as he looked for something. Each closed door made his heart race until he opened it and found the room empty. He felt a little better when he was sure that the lower levels of his house were clear. Isla might have gone somewhere. It was just after 11 a.m., so she could have gotten up and left the house. Kade tried to keep his breathing steady as he walked up the stairs so that the creaking wouldn't be too loud. His head spun back and forth as he kept checking his back to make sure no one was going to sneak up on him. He finally got to the top of the stairs, and even though he had been pretty calm before, he could feel beads of sweat forming on his forehead, which stuck some of his brown hair to his skin. The door to his room was closed. The door must be open if Isla left the house. He clenched his jaw and carefully turned the knob with his other hand, then pushed the door open. He had to take a step back when he saw it. Marco was standing over Isla, who was asleep, with the gun pointed at her head. Kade's throat felt dry and his hands got clammy as he got more and more nervous. He couldn't hide his feelings for the first time in his life. He didn't even think he could if he tried. "What are you up to?" Kade asked calmly. At least that's what he was going for. If you listened really closely, you could hear the slight waver in his voice. It was a sign of weakness, vulnerability, and uncertainty. "He told me to do it," Marco said in a harsh whisper. Kade's face looked almost like his own, with a flustered and erratic look that was the opposite of stability. He said if I don't do it, then he'll kill my girlfriend and her daughter. He choked. Marco readjusted the gun in his hands and turned off the safety. I'm sorry, he said, looking Kade in the eye. But I have to do it. Marco flinched and turned the gun on Kade when he stepped forward. Kade raised his hands in surrender and dropped his bullets on the carpet. Listen to me, Kade said. I killed him. Micah is dead. Marco, no one is going to hurt your family, but if you pull that trigger, you will lose them. Marco's eyes grew wide, and his hand shook as he held the gun, but he still wouldn't put it down. How can you be sure he doesn't have people ready to kill them as soon as I put down this gun? He hissed. I'd rather die than let them die. At any time. Kade nodded to show that he understood what was going on. At the same time, he was getting closer and closer to him, ready to take his gun and shoot him in the chest. I understand, believe me. What do you think I'm up to? Marco shook his head and clenched his jaw. I can't take the chance, he said, turning the gun back to Isla's head. But she wasn't there. What Kade took advantage of his moment of confusion to lunge at him and take the gun from him. He then shot him 3 times in the chest. Kade raised the gun to his head as he fell to the ground, gasping and clutching at his wounds. Say hi to Micah for me. When the last gunshot went off, Kade screamed and turned to see Isla on the floor in his closet. Oh baby, he said with sympathy. He dropped the gun right away and walked over to her. Isla cried and stumbled towards him, then grabbed his arms and buried her face in his chest. Her cries made it hard for her to breathe, and she choked and coughed from the pain. Isla, baby, you need to breathe, he said in a soft voice. Isla shook her head and pressed her face into his chest. Tears kept falling from her eyes in a steady stream. She hiccuped when he ran his hand down her back. You left me, she finally said with a whimper. Kade sighed and sat down on the floor, putting Isla on his lap. He whispered in her hair, you know I had to do what I did to keep you safe. But I wasn't safe. She yelled, tears filling her eyes again. You were supposed to stay here to keep me safe. Kade's eyes got big when she yelled. I know you're upset, baby, but if I hadn't done what I did earlier today, things would have been a lot worse for both of us. Isla sniffled and turned her head to the side, putting her ear on his chest. Did you kill someone? She asked in a low voice. Kade nodded slightly and pressed his tongue against the inside of his cheek. Yes. There was a moment of silence between them before Isla spoke again. Okay. She sounded like she was in shock. Kade kissed the top of her head and sighed. I'm sorry you had to see all of this, he said. Isla didn't say anything. Instead, she looked at his face and felt a little better when she saw that he wasn't hurt. But when she looked at his side, she gasped when she saw the fresh blood. Kade! She yelled, and he quickly stood up with her in his arms. What is it? What's the matter? He stammered as he looked at her body and the area around them. You're bleeding, she said in a low voice with wide eyes. What? He asked, and then he followed her gaze to see blood on his side from where he had been grazed earlier. Oh, he said when he found the wound. Adrenaline was a real pain in the ass. Isla quickly got out of his arms and unbuttoned his shirt to see how bad his injury was. "Oh my God," she said, crying when she saw blood dripping down his side. "It looks deep, Kade." Kade shook his head at the girl's over-the-top behavior when he first saw the wound. "I was grazed, and it doesn't look that bad," he said to try to calm her down. "It won't look so bad once I clean the blood off." Isla took a shaky breath and turned away from the wound. Then she screamed at the body on the floor. Kade said to himself, "I forgot that was there." "Let's go to the guest bedroom," he said, gently pulling Isla away from the body. Isla fell back, letting him pull her the other way. "Are you sure that's all there is?" Kade asked. "My guys took all of Micah's supporters out and threatened the rest of the group." "Was there a lot?" he asked with interest. 20. The rest were going with him because they were scared. Kade hummed. He didn't think it was as much as it was since he had more than 250 people working for him. He didn't think they were all a bunch of wimps, though. That made him think of the body that had been in his room a few weeks before. "Thanks again for helping me clean up the mess in my room. My girl wouldn't come into the house until it was gone." Epilogue. "Don't worry, I owe you. And you know that coming from me is a big deal." Federico nodded and gave Kade a strong pat on the back before leaving his office. Kade asked Federico to come down and get rid of everyone who was involved in Micah's crazy plan because, to be honest, he was tired. He was going to keep doing it because he still liked the excitement and adrenaline rush that came with his job. But right now, he really needed a break. He sighed, got up, wiped his face with one hand, and then left by opening the double doors. People stopped and looked the other way as soon as he got into the hallway. Their faces showed shame and fear. Instead of talking about what happened, Kade chose to let their minds wander. They only needed his silence to be afraid. As he walked by, people looked down and moved to the side, and Kade couldn't help but smile to himself. This is how it should have always been. A voice yelled from the back room, "Isla, there's another order for blueberry muffins at table 4. "Okay," she said, quickly putting 3 blueberry muffins on a plate and then rushing to the front of the cafe. She looked around quickly before finding the right table. Her small feet moved around the bodies of staff and customers to serve the people at that table. She said with a small but real smile, "Hi there, my name is Isla and I'll be another one of your servers today. Here are your muffins with blueberries." She put the plate in the middle of the 2 guests, who couldn't stop talking about how good the baked goods smelled and looked. They told her that someone else had already taken their order after she asked if they wanted any drinks. Isla smiled at them again and rushed back to the kitchen to help with the prep again. There were already a lot of people in the cafe at 11 a.m. She was getting ready to roll out the dough for an apple pie when big arms wrapped around her waist and pulled her away from the table. "You're getting so good at this," a deep voice whispered in her ear. Isla turned red because she knew who that voice belonged to, but the way he was showing off his PDA made her forget what he was saying. "Can we go somewhere more private?" she said quietly, trying to pull him to the staff room where they kept their personal things. "Why? I like it here." He kept going, not even moving when she tried to push him. "It smells good." One of his hands ran up her side and around her neck, turning it so he could put his face in the space. Kade said, I thought I told you not to start working until 2. He didn't listen to her. I don't mind helping out early. She shrugged. Kade smiled at her neck and kissed her softly before he spoke. Yes, but I would feel better if you worked fewer hours. I don't even know why you want to do all the hard work, it's your bakery. Kade had worked non-stop to get her bakery going. He felt bad about what had happened to her and thought that helping her achieve her dream of owning her own bakery would be a good way to make up for what he had done wrong. People have been able to visit it for almost 2 months, but it quickly gained a good name for itself. Kade was also involved in that. I'm fine, all I do is bake and serve. I'm only 12 weeks along, so I can do things as usual. She sighed and fought the urge to roll her eyes. Kade had been even more protective since she found out she was pregnant. A little over a month after the drama in his business, she realized she still hadn't gotten her period, even though she had taken the morning after pill. She was shocked because she thought the pill would work 100% of the time. She was wrong, though. What's wrong, pretty girl? You've been quiet and sad all week. Kade and Isla sat on a bench near the water. He thought ice cream and salt water would make her feel better because she had been acting strange for the past week. At first, he thought she was still upset about what happened at their house almost a month ago, but deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. Isla was nervous and fidgeted with her fingers. It was clear that what was bothering her was a big deal. Isla could hardly say what she needed to say to her boyfriend. Her voice was shaky and not steady. Isla was able to take a deep breath of fresh air when a wave crashed in the distance, and the wind that came with it blew. She turned to face him, and their eyes met. Her eyes were red, and his were blue. I think I'm going to have a baby. Kade's heart stopped, and his face went blank with shock. Wait, what? I thought I saw you take that pill. Kade loved Isla a lot, but he knew they weren't ready for a baby yet. He had a lot of enemies, and she was only 18. This wasn't a good situation. I did. But I don't know. I haven't gotten my, in over a month. Even in that situation, Isla couldn't help but blush when she talked about something as normal as her monthly cycle. For a while, there was only silence, with the sound of the waves and the voices of people walking by filling the space. Kade finally asked, "What do you want to do?" Isla sniffled and wiped away a single tear. "I don't want to be a mom. I've never had one, so I wouldn't even know how to be one." She stopped talking and watched as a toddler chased after their sibling in the distance. "But I also think that's why I want to try." As she finished, her voice broke, and more tears came after the one she had just wiped away. Kade picked Isla up and kissed her head to try to make her feel better. As she stopped crying, he rubbed her back and kissed her face and hair softly. "Then we'll give it a shot." Things got a lot better after they got over the shock of the pregnancy. They took a pregnancy test, which confirmed Isla's predictions. The news seemed to change the mood from sad to excited. Isla was looking forward to being a mother and Kade a father, even though she sometimes had doubts. But his protective behavior got a lot worse, which caused a lot of fights between them. She always fought him, and most of the time he won. The only time he didn't was when they were at the cafe. "You shouldn't be on your feet all day. That's why I agreed to let you start work at 2, not before. Isla rolled her eyes and turned in his arms, getting flour on his black shirt. Okay, I promise not to come early again. I'm sorry, she said with a sigh. She knew, unfortunately, that he was right, but she loved the cafe so much and wanted to help it grow. Thank you, Kade said with a sigh as he wiped away a line of flour from her cheek. You know I only want what's best for you. Do you want to kiss? She asked in a cute way, glad that they had worked out their small fight. Kade laughed and bent down to kiss her. They both smiled as they kissed. Give me a kiss, he said softly into her lips. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.